Today's scripture passage, a couple of things. One of the things I failed to announce, starting next week, a different kind of sermon series. I haven't done this sort of sermon series in a while. We're going to the movies, and it's just kind of fun to talk about themes and whatnot that are present in some of the films. And originally, I was just starting. It was going to be this Sunday was going to be the first. It starts off the month. Let's start here and go. And it dawned on me, I'm like, maybe I don't want to be super creative the Sunday that I'm really busy, right? Like this whole week, I was stuck. I had Friday afternoon and Saturday to prep for today. So maybe like coming together and trying to grab something from media. Well, I go to the lectionary passage, and this was today's lectionary reading, and it's Jesus talking about the day of rest. And for me, I felt like that was just funny enough that I'm like, after the week I had to talk about Sabbath and keeping rest. That was just one thing off the top. Second, this is also a good passage to talk about the Bible because the Bible wasn't written in chapter and verse. You with me? That was figured out later to help organize for reference sake. Originally, the stories about Jesus are like this oral tradition for much of the first generation after Jesus' life. It isn't only later that it's even written down. So the breakup of these two stories, not just by verses, by whole chapters, kind of loses the impact that this is kind of all around the same topic. Whether or not what is holy on the Sabbath, and and can you heal on the Sabbath? Can you work, eat? Can you do good and heal? This passage introduces and explains to us some of the big antagonists to Jesus as described in the Gospels. Now, Jewish life in the time of Jesus is rich and diverse. It's not like good guys and bad guys, Jesus followers and everybody else. And even if you get past that, sometimes Christians, when we lump in all the people that Jesus is talking to, we can almost slip into some anti-Semitism. The Pharisees are frequently painted in the Gospels as like bad guys. Were much more complex. The questions that they dealt with, the world that they lived in, had texture and meaning. What I'm trying to say, at the time of Christ, one of the big questions in that world is, what does it mean to be Jewish? How did you understand who was a Jew and who wasn't? There were some who would say it is by blood. You had to be born a Jew, and blood. If you're in, both of your parents had to be it. If you read the books of Ezekiel, that's one of the conversations, because the Jews have been spread out into the diaspora. They're now living in wide spectrum of places, and they started marrying people. And when the second temple gets rebuilt, they start coming back, and people are like, you married a different kind of person? What? That you have kids? So you can see how blood might be problematic. Well, then it's about the country. It's about the ruler. It's about who's your king. That didn't swing a whole lot of folks because the Jewish people had gotten conquered. And that at the time of Jesus, Rome had its boot on their neck. Well, it's about the religious life. That makes it so much simpler, it being about the religious life. Well, in a previous generation, it was about the temple. The temple is where God lived. Well, buildings can get torn down. Did you catch what I said earlier? The second temple is what happened to the first one. Torn down. So here you have the second temple. Well, this is actually where the Pharisees are an answer. Because what they said was, it's not about blood, it's not about who's king, it's not about where you live, it's about the text. And you living according to the text. Your faithfulness to our way of living. And so you can see how Jesus showing up kind of puts a challenge in this story. When the rule is you don't get to do work on the Sabbath. And here's you can't pick grain in the fields. And here's Jesus' disciples just going, oh, I need a snack. You can't, Jesus, if your employment is healer, what are you doing that on the Sabbath for? You're supposed to be having a break. You can see how the intentions, the motivations of the Pharisees, whereas for some of us, just a plain reading, it might just be like, I love the old bad guy narrative where they have a big long mustache that they twirl. And sometimes the Pharisees are painted like that, how can we get that Jesus? If we could just catch him in the wrong, that'll do it. That's not it. They have good intentions, but Jesus is challenging them. And it's getting fundamentally uncomfortable for them for the Jesus message. And it kind of surrounds, what is God's intention around Sabbath? So, let me ask you, what motivates you? You know, the phrase is what gets you up in the morning? Whatever motivates you, it's not necessarily always a good intention. And what motivates you might not always be a bad. It might not be, what fuel do you run on? I guess that's a way of putting it. I'm reminded of an actor, really famous on screen, on stage. He's got a couple of shows. I don't know who knows him just by name, but John Lithgow. He was the Third Rock from the Sun. He was the guy. I remember a late night show. It's he had just gotten done with 2 different performances at the same time and filming a movie, and he was asked, how do you pull that off? We're what is it that keeps you coming and working that hard? And he just looks at the congregation, at the audience, and goes, applause. Does that ring true for any of you? Hearing, yes, honesty, that's what I love. And it could be the external applause. It could be that internal, the thing that you're and I did that. And that's and whether or not other people see it, that internal motivation. Maybe you have an external motivation, maybe one of the lessons you learned early on is that the world isn't safe. And your job is to be a protector for your people or for you. The world might be out to get you, and you gotta put up a wall of protection either around you and around the people you care about. A friend of mine who is just like that says to me, you know what my motivator is? I run very well on spite. Tell me I can't do something. I dare you. I will write down your critical comments and I will say it to myself every morning. What fuel do you run on? Maybe you have inside of you a guiding compass of what's right and wrong. That there is a right way of the world, the way things ought to be. And you will use whatever powers that you have been given, whatever gifts that you have received to help right the wrongs of the world. And just that internal compass is enough. Or as my dad used to say, anything worth doing is worth doing right. There's some folks, what drives them is just the desire to be them. To not have any strings attached. Do you know anybody who is self-employed simply because they couldn't have a boss? Ever? If anybody's a kind of authority in their life, it's right. They immediately meet with skepticism or cynicism, any authority figure, whether that's a doctor or a boss. Maybe what fuels you is purpose. There is a goal to be achieved, a dragon to slay. You want to be useful. For some, the internal purpose is safety. And not just like, I need to protect myself safety, but I like to think of it as, there's a balance to be achieved for almost all of us. Do you live to work? Like you really love your job. Like what you do for work, it just fuels you, gives you energy. You could do that, like you have to remind yourself to take a day off. So you live to work, or do you work to live? Like what you do is a paycheck so that you can do the things you want to do. I don't live in that dichotomy, I want to do both, but like I understand that a lot of people do. But there's some folks who their job is, whether or not they enjoy their job is never a question. Because it's not really about enjoyment, it's about what do I get to do because of my work. Safety is, I think people who run on that safety, if I can provide more for the life I want to lead, that's a motivating factor. And also, whole nother thing is the seek for harmony. You may have seen it in TV shows or movies, or you just have this image in your head. I always picture like the ideal party, reception, wedding venue. You think about it, it's outdoors, it's got string lights and it's dusk, the sun is going down, there's plenty of food, you got some older folks playing cards over here, there's an elderly couple slow dancing, the kids are like quickly dancing in the side, there's some group that's having jokes while they're doing the dishes, there's music in the air, everybody's getting along, like there's a little bit of wine but not too much. That harmonious, like it's just the ideal celebration that I don't know if you've ever seen, I think might only be on screens. But that kind of spirit is the thing that you want in your work life, you want in your marriage, you want at home. If you could tap into that, that would be the goal. What motivates and moves you in your relationships, in your work? Frequently, some of the greatest conflicts that exist is when what motivates you, so you have a goal, you have a project, you're at work, you're in a marriage, and what motivates you doesn't motivate the other person. And then that comes in right in here. Somebody who is internally motivated, someone who it's just about being right, doesn't need applause and doesn't need the gratification from others. How do those two people always end up together? If you've noticed. This brings us to this conversation that Jesus is having with the Pharisees about God's desire for us. See, the Pharisees are motivated by preserving the Jewish identity. I don't see them as being motivated to, we just got to find a reason to kill Jesus. That's not what they're motivated by. They are afraid that what they have spent a whole generation defending is now in danger. How they've come to understand who their God is, in particular on the holy day of the week, is being threatened. And Jesus provides an example, what we would normally call proof texting. He just pulls out this passage about how David goes into the temple and grabs some food that he wasn't allowed to eat, disregarding the fact that David was starving to death. And here we have just the disciples walking through a field casually. And here we also have Jesus healing a man with a withered hand. And I slowed down my reading of that, and I hope you caught it. Being angry with them. I should pull it up. Just make sure you heard me. Because sometimes, even the Jesus I preach frequently comes across as just the happiest guy in the world. Because if he can't be, He looked around them with anger. That's not a mistranslation. It's the emotional equivalent, anger. He looked at them, and then he performs a miracle. Healing while angry. Don't tell your doctor that that's okay. Write you this prescription. And then he was grieved at their hardness of heart. And that's kind of a play on words. He's grieved of their hardness of heart. Because, okay, so here in the West, your heart and your guts, like if you fall in love, you're madly in love. But what's the cartoon? What organ of the body grows? Your heart, right? And that's where that translation comes in, is like their hardness of heart. Where if you experience such epic grief where you are crushed, what is have you heard this phrase? It felt like I got punched in the gut. That's the word choice. The gut. In Greek, it's splagchnizomai. The very gut where all emotion is born. This is where Jesus is wrenched. Because he's looking at the situation. They don't see healing on the Sabbath as being okay, and his gut is just wrenched. They just don't get it. Their motivations are just skewed. Thankfully, in church life, we have settled this. And no longer do people bring false intentions into church services. Their opinions of church are all aligned under the banner of Jesus, and we no longer conflict over what's appropriate to be worn, what's appropriately to be done. We all agree on the one way to worship God. In my very first appointment, I had a member named John. He was a World War II vet. Loved the guy. He was a very lovely man. Nice. And he wore a suit every Sunday. If you're a member of the Greatest Generation, putting on a suit every day is its own activity. Right? I saw him one Tuesday for Bible study. Just overalls, this big hat, World War II veteran, all the buttons. John was just a ham, and I loved him. And I asked him if, because I'm showing up and I'm not wearing a suit. Even though my dad raised me like that, I mean, my parents raised me in the old way. Like, you dress, like your tie can be slightly askew after the end of the service. That was kind of the dress code. And I asked John, does that bother you at all? I mean, I'm 25, and I'm like, I just don't want to make him mad. John looks at me and he goes, it's not about you. I'm like, what? Look, I mean, I'm not going to do the impersonation. John says, I've spent 90 years worshiping God one way. This is how I meet him. I got to get up 3 hours ahead of time now in order to put on each piece and then rest enough so I can get here and worship God the way I feel. You want to worship God and you think you can pull off the sandals? I guess Jesus wore sandals. He was fine, but that's for me, like, what's appropriate to be worn in church? What brings you closer to God? You notice that Jesus doesn't actually disregard the Sabbath at all, but Jesus highlights the Sabbath exists to serve, not for us to serve the Sabbath. I think some Christians look at church services as the ends in their own. Like it's the goal is just to have church, when the goal is for the church to have you. The goal is for the church to have you, not for you to have church. Now I want to lead from there. I want to lead with compassion and care. And I'm thankful for a church that has done that for so many different kinds of people. I think the story, one of the things that, if you listen to the sermon that I gave on Thursday, I start with 4 different stories. In my first draft of the sermon, I had 9. And that doesn't surprise any of the regular Spirit of Hope folks. They're like, he talks for so long. One of the stories I would have shared, because I ended with a story about Spirit of Hope, was when my friends come. My friends don't usually come halfway to church. They're above, they're beyond, they kind of try to drink in the like, I got a lot of friends who, if they were going to express themselves, it's really loud. And when they got here, every single one of them commented how welcomed they were, how cared for. Thank you for that, Spirit of Hope. It gives me hope that the way this church exists, it's like you've heard Jesus say that what the real meaning of the Sabbath is for. I pray that as the days roll on, we grow into that even more. Amen.